The Horn of Africa is facing the worst food crisis right now. There's many reasons for that. Conflict is certainly one of them, but another is because they're facing the worst drought that they've had in 70 years. They've had 5 consecutive poor rainy seasons. They're looking at a 6th, probably another poor rainy season happening between now and May, likely to be flooding after that. A lot of different numbers floating around, but the UN reports that it could be up to 27 million people across the Horn, which is Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, who are in need of emergency food assistance.
The UN Sustainable Development Goals are a call to action by 2023. The second one is zero hunger. We have some work to do. At one point earlier in this century, it seemed that famine might be a thing of the past. Then there was a famine in Somalia in 2011, and now in 2023, at least 6 countries are at risk. Further, the World Food Program says that more than 900,000 people worldwide are in famine-like conditions, and 345 million are food insecure, the highest level since World War II. Of course, the effects are massively far-ranging, from economic to political and beyond. This stuff is very hard to understand. There are many causes of famine, but paradoxically, over the past 100+ years, global lack of food, according to experts, has not been one of them. Frequently discussed causes include conflict, drought, and now pandemic-induced supply problems and slashed exports from Ukraine. Hard to understand. What tools does the international community have to remedy and to prevent famine? We will address these questions tonight and more with our expert speakers, Kimberly Flowers and Alex de Waal. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Eintema, president of WorldBoston, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Great Decisions program. Kimberly Flowers has built a career in international development, public policy, and strategic communications. Most recently, she served as the executive director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs at Colby College. From 2015 to 2020, she was with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, addressing the effectiveness of U.S. foreign assistance programs and policies that impact global poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. Her background includes years working for the U.S. Agency for International Development, including in Ethiopia and Haiti, and leading strategic communications for President Obama's Global Food and Nutrition Security Initiative. She's a frequent speaker and moderator on discussions related to global hunger, foreign aid, and public affairs. Thanks for joining us, Kimberly. We're also joined by Alex de Waal. He's the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts Fletcher School. A leading expert on Sudan and the Horn of Africa, his scholarly work and practice have also probed humanitarian crisis and response, human rights, HIV/AIDS, and governance in Africa, and conflict and peace building. His latest book is Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine, and he's also the author of The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa. He's spent extensive time in Africa, including with the African Union mediation team for Darfur and the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan, where he took on a number of roles in negotiations leading to the independence of South Sudan. Alex was on the list of Foreign Affairs' 100 Most Influential Public Intellectuals in 2008 and the Atlantic Monthly's 27 Brave Thinkers of 2009. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. With that, I turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. It's Mary for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. As you mentioned, Mary, we're in a world food crisis, but it's a crisis that is perhaps often misunderstood, misrepresented. So I thought I would start by giving a few definitions to help clarify what we're talking about so that we're all on the same page. So there are 3 key concepts that we can start with. Food security, which is, according to the UN, access of all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. There's starvation, which is the phenomenon when some people do not have enough food to eat. It's not the phenomenon of there not being enough food to eat. It's not a phenomenon of food shortage. And there's famine, which is variously defined, but that is the extreme, fortunately very rare type of episode of widespread hunger and higher mortality. Next slide, please. So there are three elements that come together in food security and in different configurations in different food crises. There's food availability, which is what policymakers tend to focus upon very much in public statements. Levels of food production, supply, reflected in food prices. There's food entitlement, the ability of poor people to obtain enough food through their own production, wages, gifts, or benefits. And there's acts of starvation, which is the issue I've been particularly working on, the deliberate deprivation of people by military, political, or criminal acts. The verb to starve can be both transitive and intransitive. It's something that people can do to one another. And what we often hear when very senior policymakers talk, such as the UN Secretary General, is they'll mention all these three elements, but then they fasten in the hard part of what they're talking about, their proposals for action. They just talk about food availability and supply. Let me just give in a few graphs and a few figures about what is happening in each of these areas. Next slide, please. So this is food prices, international food prices against an index of 100 being the average food price in the early part of this century. And as you will see, there has been really quite a spike. There are three global food crises this century. And last year had the sharpest spike up to a peak of about 160 over 100 against the index. It's gone down slightly. But next slide. If you compare this, if you compare this with the 20th century averages, this slide goes only up to 2008. But if it were to continue up to the current day, it would spike a bit higher, but not that much higher. We're only still with our current food price spike at about the average level for the 20th century. So it is not by historic standards, but if we go back to the 70s or the 40s or the era around World War I, we're not in an enormous, unprecedented crisis. Next slide. As Mary mentioned, there are huge numbers of people. The UN's preferred figure is 345 million food insecure people around the world, which is a big increase from last year, about 70 million up from last year. So a very worrying trend. And if we use other indicators, the figures might be even higher. And what's particularly notable about this pattern is, first of all, the concentration of the numbers of people in sub-Saharan Africa and part of the Middle East. Haiti doesn't figure very high very large on this map, but is quite serious. North Korea is not on the map. There's a missing data point there. And in fact, some of the worst places, Zimbabwe, South Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, North Korea, Afghanistan, don't have enough data. And this is a problem. And let me come on to that for the next slide, because this next slide is acute food insecurity, which measured by the US government's, USAID's food and famine early warning system. And here we see in red the places where the most serious food insecurity is occurring, where people are at risk of famine. And we see that in a handful of places around the world, in parts of Somalia, southeastern Ethiopia, where there's serious drought. But most of the places are conflict-affected places, northern Ethiopia, Tigray, where in the last couple of years, perhaps 500,000 people, we don't know the real figures, but that's the best estimate, 500,000 people perished through hunger and disease. In Yemen, the figures also are not very good, but they indicate very, very serious levels. And then some pockets in West Africa. There has been a very serious situation in northeastern Nigeria associated with the insurgency of the extremist group Boko Haram and the counterinsurgency by the Ethiopian government. And we see something similar a bit further to the west on the borderlands of Burkina Faso and Mali, where there's similarly an extremist insurgency and counterinsurgency. And so the most serious cases are associated with conflict and what I would call starvation crimes. Next slide, please. So the war crime of starvation has gained a lot of attention over recent years. It was specified in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in these terms: intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies. And objects indispensable to survival isn't just food, it's also water, it's also medicine, it's shelter, especially in cold areas, in Afghanistan, in the mountains of Iraq and Syria, and also maternal care for young children is essential for survival. So acts of policies of rape can be starvation crimes as well, because a woman survivor of rape may not be able to care for herself and her children. And the reality is that in modern history, most famines, and especially the most lethal famines, have been caused by one or more of imperial conquest, total war, genocidal policies, or communist social engineering. Next slide, please. So this, which is my penultimate slide, shows how historic trends in numbers of famines, that's on the left, and we see a general downward trend, the big peaks being in the 1940s, the war years, a downward trend more or less since then. And the numbers killed in famines, also a very dramatic reduction over the last 25, 30 years. We're seeing those numbers go up, but to nothing like the levels they were in the mid-20th century. We don't see yet the return of Mao with his terrible Great Leap Forward famine in the 1950s, Stalin with what he did to the Ukrainians in the Holodomor, or Hitler with his hunger plan to starve millions to death in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. We see smaller, but nonetheless significant war famines. And my very final slide shows the general picture, which is that over the last 150 years, active political repression, especially by dictatorships, especially communist dictatorships and the Nazis, and armed conflict have been overwhelmingly the cause of famine mortality, not food insecurity in general, but famine mortality. So I think if we are going to look at the tools that we're going to use to reduce, to overcome these food crises, we need to attend to all of these three elements: to food availability, to food entitlement, the ability of poor people to get food through having livable wages and so on, viable livelihoods, and ending starvation crimes, ending the impunity of those who perpetrate famine on defenseless civilians in wartime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, Kimberly, you can go right ahead.
Great. Thanks, Alex. That's a great foundation to build off. It's just such an honor to join you in this conversation. And I know Mary mentioned it at the beginning, but those that are really interested in this topic, I strongly encourage you to read Alex's book called Mass Starvation. I learned a lot from it and really respect his research and thinking. And thank you, Mary and WorldBoston, for hosting this event. This topic does not get enough attention in the news, and we appreciate you bringing it to the attention of your members and your audience. I'm going to start with a little bit more of general context, talking about the global food crisis that we're in right now. I'll also touch on the role of conflict, just building on what Alex said, And I'll dive pretty deep into the impact of the war in Ukraine and some of the challenges with that F word, or the official famine declaration, in that system. So first, I want to be clear, the world is facing a hunger and malnutrition crisis of pretty historic proportions right now. Yet there's no country that's, meets the official definition of famine. So we aren't in a global famine per se, but we are in the midst of a global food security crisis. And the scale is enormous. I think these big numbers are really hard to kind of put in your brain, but you have over 828 million who are hungry. This number has been mentioned already a few times, the 345 million that are acutely food insecure. Alex mentioned that was 70 million more than last year. The statistic I found was that was 200 million more from pre-pandemic levels. So it does show you that the impact of the pandemic that it's had on people having acute food insecurity. And Alex already mentioned about, the rising or the spike in food prices, which is really important to keep in mind. So all in all, we're moving backwards in terms of progress on international efforts to eliminate hunger and nutrition. Mary mentioned this at the beginning, that there was a decline for a decade and some real progress that we were making in terms of global hunger. But now, because of protracted conflicts, climate change, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, we are certainly not going to be meeting the United Nations Zero Hunger Sustainable Development Goal by 2030. I want to emphasize one point, because I'm going to bring up Ukraine a lot. The Russians' invasion of Ukraine certainly has further exacerbated the global food crisis, but it didn't create it. It's increased the numbers of those facing acute food insecurity, but those numbers were already rising before the invasion, again, thanks to conflict, climate change, and COVID-19. So where is it worse? You saw those maps that Alex pointed out. The Horn of Africa is facing the worst food crisis right now. There's many reasons for that. Conflict is certainly one of them, but another is because they're facing the worst drought that they've had in 70 years. They've had 5 consecutive poor rainy seasons. They're looking at a 6th, probably another poor rainy season happening between now and May, likely to be flooding after that. A lot of different numbers floating around, but the UN reports that it could be up to 27 million people across the Horn, which is Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, who are in need of emergency food assistance. The other areas that Alex mentioned, that one of his maps was FuseNet. That's the US-funded Famine Early Warning Network. The places that they're also looking at, besides Horn of Africa and Northern Ethiopia, are South Sudan, Yemen, Burkina Faso, and Northeast Nigeria. I would be remiss not to mention that women are disproportionately affected by hunger. Upwards of 150 million more women versus men suffer from hunger. If you're into percentage points, looking at 2021, there was a gap of 4 percentage points versus 3 the year before in 2020. So that gap seems to be getting bigger, unfortunately. We've certainly already mentioned and made the point that this is not about food production. This is not about food shortage. This is predominantly about conflict. Also, there's economic shocks, there's climate extremes, and there's the soaring food, fuel, and fertilizer prices, which we'll get into a little bit more. And I don't want to, we can't talk about everything here, of course, but I don't want to overlook the impact of climate change. South Sudan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, all of these countries that we're listing are really on the front lines of climate change, and they're confronting droughts, floods, desertification, water scarcity, and those have a huge impact too. Not to downplay conflict, because absolutely the number one driver is conflict. 70% of the world's hunger live in places that are afflicted by war and violence. Conflict also disrupts harvests. It hampers the delivery of humanitarian aid and access. It also forces families to flee their homes. It also relates to migration. But let's talk about Ukraine, because I think that's an area that's on most people's minds. So when we talk about conflict, it's not always conflict in your own country or even region. I think this is a great example, or not a great example, but an example of how a war in a different continent has trickled down and has really affected global trade and supply chains. So Ukraine is considered the breadbasket of Europe, and Russia and Ukraine are among the top 5 global exporters of barley, sunflower, maize, and account for 1/3 of the world's wheat exports. So this invasion has disrupted international supply chains. It's pushed up food and fertilizer prices. And this comes at a time where supply chains were already adversely affected by the pandemic, by increasing frequent extreme climate events, and especially in these low-income countries that we're talking about. Many countries, particularly in Africa, rely on Russia and Ukraine for a huge percentage of their wheat, fertilizer, and vegetable oil imports. The war has disrupted not just global commodity markets, but also trade flows to Africa. And this is happening when there were already high food prices in the region. Of 55 countries that are in a food crisis right now, 36 depend on Ukrainian and Russian exports for more than 10% of their wheat. So let me give you some examples that are even bigger. In Nigeria, the world's fourth largest wheat importer, receives a fourth of its imports from Russia and Ukraine. You've got Cameroon, Tanzania, Uganda, and Sudan source more than 40% of their wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. WFP buys half of its wheat that it distributes around the world from Ukraine. So you can see how this is making impacts all around the world. And we have to talk about fertilizer. Fertilizer is a really big deal, and global fertilizer prices have climbed incredibly high, even higher than food prices. The effects of the war in Ukraine is including higher natural gas prices, but it's really disrupted global fertilizer production and exports. And this has all kinds of trickle-down effects in terms of reducing supplies, raising prices, and threatening to reduce harvest. So this is going to be a long-term effect. It's going to affect production of food in the future. I want to emphasize again, though, I've already said it, but the global food crisis we're seeing today is exacerbated the war in Ukraine, but it didn't create it. One other point that I was reading when I was thinking about this was David Miliband. He's the head of the International Rescue Committee. He did an interview with NPR a few months ago, and he brought up that in addition to driving food prices globally, the war in Ukraine has also served as an excuse to decrease aid dollars from international donors. The exception to this is the United States, and we can talk about this more if we need to later, but the United States has actually done the reverse and put more money into East Africa because of the war in Ukraine and trying to work on its impacts. So let's talk about famine, and I know I need to probably wrap up. So famine's only been declared twice in the last decade. It was Somalia 2011 and South Sudan in 2017. It likely could have happened in southern Somalia the last year, but there was no declaration that the UN made. And part of that is because how difficult it is to access the areas and get the right information. So in order for there to be an official famine declaration, there has to be this certain criteria that's met. And I have it in front of me. We can go into the detail, but I don't know if it's necessarily that important to have that level. But what you need to know is that there's this group. It's called the IPC Famine Review Committee. It's like an independent team of food and nutrition experts that go into an area and try to collect data in order to see if it meets this certain criteria. And that's incredibly hard to do in conflict zones. It's also incredibly hard to do when the governments don't want to give you that information because they don't want famine declared in their country, or when insurgents have blocked a certain area because they are, of course, both sides in many conflicts using food as a weapon of war. So it's really complicated to get even the data necessary to meet that famine threshold. Yet, as we've given you all these numbers, we know that we have some of the highest levels of food insecurity since World War II. And famines, of course, tend to occur and happen where humanitarian access is restricted. I think I'll stop there. I'll just repeat a few things that we can get into more if we want to talk about the tools to prevent and respond. But I think the big takeaways is we are really in a massive global food crisis right now. This has been building since the pandemic. Protracted conflicts, climate change, as well as the war in Ukraine are just adding on to a system that's pretty, I don't want to say broken, but I will say stretched. You know, there's not enough funding to meet all of these needs. You have labor issues in terms of people, wanting to work in these issues, able to get access into these areas. So there's a lot of work ahead, but we, without a doubt, have the right amount of food. We have the right knowledge and tools, the right tools to give us even just to know where the hot spots are. But it takes a lot of political will, which is sometimes quite difficult when you're talking about conflict. Back over to you.
Okay, thank you both, Alex and Kimberly, very much for your overview of what, of course, is a very complicated topic. So I have a question for either of you, just a simple little one. What works? You both have deep experience in conflicted, famine-threatened areas. What works to reduce famine if the conflict is ongoing? Just a little question. Presumably, for example, the war in Ukraine is not going to be solved imminently. So what has worked, what is working in conflict zones to avert famine?
Shall I go on that?
You go first. You go first.
A lot of sophistication has been gained over the last 20, 30 years, in how to run humanitarian operations in war zones. And a lot of expertise about sort of navigating the complexities of armed groups, of demanding that belligerents respect international humanitarian law that allows them to have access, that prevents them from perpetrating starvation crimes, and so on. It's not ideal, what is truly effective, of course, is ending the war. What I think we find particularly disturbing at the moment, though, is that over the last couple of years, after the last 5-6 years, we've seen a number of incidents where governments in particular have deliberately pursued starvation crimes on a very large scale and prevented access and got the compliance of international organizations and governments in doing this. So there are a number of cases we could mention: northeastern Nigeria, which was essentially under a blackout, much of Yemen, but I think the most egregious case is Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And Kimberly mentioned the Famine Review Committee of the IPC, the Integrated Phase Classification Food Security System. Their experts went there in June of 2021. And they said without an end to the war and without a massive aid, they were certain there would be famine within 3 months. And after that, the Ethiopian government tightened the siege, prevented aid from going in, the war intensified, and they prevented the UN from having any access to gather any data. And because the data were not gathered, there was no famine declaration. And we now know with a relative degree of certainty that somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 people, most of them children, perished of hunger in Tigray. And if that's not a famine, the word really has no meaning. And famine was actually, if that wasn't bad enough, what I find particularly shocking is that starvation was actually an effective tool. It brought the Tigrayans to their knees, forced them to surrender. And whatever you think about the politics of the conflict, and of course there are arguments to be made on both sides, the fact that you can force a group to abandon its political objectives and surrender by starving it at that scale is something we have not seen since the Biafran War in the late 1960s, and so the world has not marshaled that level of outrage to call out to stop these crimes. I was encouraged that Secretary Blinken, when he was in Addis Ababa, said that crimes against humanity had been perpetrated in the Ethiopian war, but he didn't specifically mention starvation, and I very much hope that will become top of the U.S. agenda in the coming statements.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything Alex said. I mean, first and foremost, because we're dealing with conflict, it's about the U.S. I'm speaking from more of the U.S. angle because it's who I used to work for as USAID, but there's the diplomatic side and there's the development side. So in terms of making it, whether it's a ceasefire or whether it's, putting pressure on governments, that needs to come from the diplomatic side. So it's ensuring that our diplomatic leaders understand the gravity of a situation and that they use all the tools necessary behind closed doors and in public to exert the right pressure to see if that can make any difference. That's one. But then on the other side of it too, when I say development, I'm talking about both kind of that emergency humanitarian aid as well as the long-term sort of development programs, because both are important. And there's a lot of different nuances to that. But one thing that I'll just say is that is the importance of focusing on nutrition. And what I mean by that is it's not just an increase of food production in terms of staple crops, but it's thinking about the role of nutrition in terms of a community in general and how you can bolster that up before a conflict might begin, that they can have the right tools, as well as thinking about specifically children under 5 and therapeutic foods. That's really important as well. Another thing that's important in terms of the humanitarian development aid is localization. It is not happening at all on the level that has been promised for many, many summits going back now. And I bring that up because in conflict settings, localization can really matter in terms of, whether it's an international NGO or a big UN agency or a local NGO that knows the players and the people might have better access to get the right kind of aid into the most vulnerable communities. So I think localization also has a really important role to play in terms of conflict settings. One other thing I just have to mention, since we brought up Ethiopia, is just the role of social safety nets. The government of Ethiopia should be criticized for a whole lot of things related to northern Ethiopia right now, but also they've created a good social safety net program that has been able to help a lot of vulnerable communities that is helpful for many areas. It doesn't always stand up in terms of conflict, but it's worth mentioning and worth noting.
Great, thank you. I think we'll go to Maitri.
Yes, thank you so much for your comments. I've definitely learned a lot from the statistics you all mentioned. I'm curious, both of you mentioned how the UN and other international organizations, and I know Kimberly, you recently mentioned localization and NGOs. I'm curious, how do you think, specifically since Alex, you mentioned how there's the aspect of these are political crimes that dictatorships and these regimes are doing. How on the international level can we enforce these, take action in addressing these problems if these leaderships aren't following international law? So
thank you. It's a very good question. And there are a number of instruments that we can use. I mean, there's the Red Cross and the international humanitarian law, which has been there for a while. Though, oddly enough, it was actually only a relatively latecomer to introduce prohibitions on starvation to the Geneva Conventions.
While we're asking questions,
it wasn't there during for much of history. There's a very interesting development at the UN Security Council some 5 years ago, a resolution on armed conflict and hunger, 2417. It was initiated jointly by the Netherlands and by the Obama administration, and the Netherlands were the pen holder after the transition to the Trump administration. And this was adopted unanimously. It says that the use of hunger as a weapon of war may be a war crime, and it puts obligations on the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General. So the Secretary General is supposed to report to the Council when widespread food insecurity is threatened by armed conflict. So armed conflict may be creating famine or something similar. And it opens the door to sanctions being imposed on those who violate this. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is that there has been a coalition of states that don't want to see any action on this. We had the Irish in the Security Council championing it, trying to bring up issues, but we had consistent efforts by Ethiopia, Russia, China, and a few others to block that, sadly. Another form of action is the potential for prosecutions. I put up on the slide the war crime of starvation under over which the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction, and I very much hope that we will see a prosecution for that war crime at some point. But even without that, I think the drawing public attention to the fact that these are crimes, these are outrages, is an act of solidarity with the victims. It's very important for those who have survived famine, which is an incredibly degrading and humiliating experience in which, mothers are forced to choose which child to feed. People are forced into the most humiliating activities to stay alive, and turning away needy people, your neighbors, your friends from your door. And these are the things that stick in people's hearts. And to be told it wasn't your fault, this was a crime inflicted on you, this was a man-made famine, and the gender language is very specific. I've not seen a woman-made famine.
That's usually my line, Alex.
So just to affirm publicly that the true nature of these things is I think a very important act of public diplomacy and shifting public opinion and giving solace to the victims and survivors.
The only thing I would add to that is I think the UN structure is there. I mean, I think the language is there, but I don't think that that's necessarily the pressure that's going to work. Or at least it hasn't in the past. It would be great if it did. But I think what we need, and Alex alluded to this, but I'll be a little more blunt, but we need bolder and braver leaders to really understand this issue and call the people out, meaning call out the governments and the government leaders that are doing these actions. And that's the hard thing to do politically, but that's what we need. I think that's the only way that there's going to be real action. And then perhaps after those bold, brave leaders call out the right people, then the UN system can kick into gear. But we just haven't really seen it happen yet. And I think it's just because our leaders are so overwhelmed with so many issues happening in the world that this just isn't as high as a priority as it should be.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We'll go to Ed Martins now. Go ahead, Ed.
We do. Hello. Thank you for your talk. One of the problems is they say, give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach a man to fish he eats for a lifetime. Once the guns settle and things like that, how much do your organizations, or how much aid is there to help these people start producing their own food? Is there aid available, things like that? And another thing is, a problem that we cause is that we dump on the world market subsidized food all the time. I don't know if we're still doing that. We were notorious for doing that. We got many complaints from around the world for that, how this would suppress food production in these countries because they couldn't compete against our subsidies. Thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to tackle that?
I'll tackle that one first. Well, there's a lot of responses, Ed. I mean, I think the first is that while the U.S. has certainly made some mistakes in the past in terms of subsidizing food and putting like rice in Haiti when it wasn't needed, I do think that the majority of that is in the past. Any food aid that's brought into a market now, there's a congressionally mandated review that has to be done to make sure that it's the right move for the local market. So I do think that's a bit of a misconception about aid. The other thing about aid is absolutely 100%, a majority of the aid that the United States gives to these other countries is to support smallholder farmers and global food systems. So it is, while there is certainly emergency food aid that is given, There is $1 billion a year that's going to targeted countries, targeted places to make sure that smallholder farmers, which there are a huge majority of, unfortunately, of the people suffering from hunger are majority farmers, but that they are learning about how to use better fertilizers, better inputs, cold chain, all making sure that they're linking up to better producers. So I see this all the time in my work. I think it's a very hidden thing. I think a lot of the general public, unfortunately, doesn't see that. I'm going to be really specific because I just started a new consulting job with what's called the USAID Africa Trade and Investment Program. It's a huge program that covers the whole continent of Africa. And I am not a trade or finance expert person, but my job is, because US Congress gave additional money, to see how we can create new local private sector partnerships on the ground in some of these countries to try to help with some of the issues from the impact of Ukraine. So that means, how can we create a better, local fertilizer company to locally produce fertilizer rather than importing it, for example. So I think there's a lot of these programs out there that are happening. I just think they're hidden, or they're just not well publicized to the public. They're not all perfect either, so don't let me just be a cheerleader. There are issues too, but in general, we are teaching people how to fish.
Let me just add one point to that, which is that the good news stories in this field don't get any publicity. Like 7 years ago, there was a very, very serious drought in Ethiopia, the largest in its history, as severe as the one they have now. And the Ethiopian government itself responded. It put up the first 500 million. And that allowed assistance to go to farmers before they left their land, so that they could keep their, they could plant, they could keep their livestock, they could stay. And it was, and because the Ethiopian government moved first, then the World Food Programme and others had a lot of confidence and they moved in, and it was highly successful. Did any journalist cover it? No. There was, the famine averted story is not a news story. And so it's a lot of good things are happening. We're just not hearing about them.
Okay, so I just want to, thank you. I just want to remind our participants that we are here for questions. So don't go with your question unasked. It's really not scary. And you will get some very good answers, as you have seen. So please step right up or raise your hand right up. I think we are going to Mary Mendoza now.
Hi. Hi. You mentioned having arrest warrants for people who've done awful things, like, for example, Putin. But the reality of it is that Putin is probably never, ever going to darken the doorstep of the International Criminal Court. In fact, we're still trying to get Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, and there was an arrest warrant for him. I mean, doesn't it almost fall kind of sort of like the, what good does it do to have an arrest warrant? I mean, it's a totally different thing than, for example, let's say Donald Trump being charged, because here in the U.S., the Secret Service would have to go, okay, we got to turn him in, and he would wind up being dragged. It might not be the perp walk a lot of people want to see him, but, it's kind of pineapples and apples. So, I mean, they're symbolic and all well and good, but...
Okay, great.
How do you actually get...
Yep. No, it's absolutely a good point. And of course, the moment you start talking about criminalizing something, the lawyers get all excited and they want to have a very high profile case in which they can, prove themselves and prove all sorts of legal precedents, etc. I think the real issues of accountability won't come through, a high profile case. I mean, I would love to see one of these criminals, in the ICC. I've been a witness at the ICC, and I'm very much in favor of it. But I think that's not what's going to change things. But there's a whole lot of other things short of that. So that, if we are dealing, for example, as the US government is dealing with, let's come back to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government, its soldiers went into Tigray and they destroyed a whole lot of infrastructure that was paid for by USAID and the World Bank and so on. Now, are we going to put money into the Ethiopian government to rebuild that? Or are we going to say to the Ethiopians, no, we paid for this once already. Now this is your responsibility. Similarly, tens of thousands of women have been raped. and there are thousands and thousands of children born of rape. Should it not? These are children of the state. They are children of a policy of forced rape, forced pregnancy. Is it not the responsibility of that state to care for these kids? So that all these issues of restitution, compensation, responsibility that fall short of bringing a senior commander to the ICC, that we can pursue through other policy means.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add. So we can go on to the next question because he knows more than I do.
Okay, great. So we'll go to Ruel now. Ruel, go right ahead. Hi there.
Thank you. Very interesting talk so far. I had thought that it might be another possibility for delivering food to the places which are in military conflict. We used to use airlifts in the old days, but airlifts, of course, can be shut down. What do you think of the possibility that countries, a consortium of countries could get together and organize maybe high altitude drone delivery, so there wouldn't be people involved who could be shut down and killed as a result of trying to deliver the food? And we have new technology for accurate delivery from high altitudes, avoid anything but the highest altitude missiles to knock
Okay, I think
down. Just a thought.
Great. All right. Who wants to give that a try?
I think there are a number of considerations that would need to come in. One is that for any government that opposes or is suspicious of an international effort of this type, they would take it as a hostile act. They would say, to begin with, how do we know what you are dropping there? Maybe it's weapons. And there's a question of cost as well. I think the air deliveries are quite cost effective for medicines and very light items. But if in the case of Yemen or Ethiopia or Afghanistan, you need 100, 150 truckloads a day. The cost of doing this by airlift, let alone by drone, would, I think, be prohibitive. But it's not to say that for very specific commodities like medicines, that sort of technology couldn't be quite useful.
Okay, thank you. So I think we now have Mary Ellen. Is that right?
Yes. Right. I'm from Westwood, Massachusetts, and I'm part of the Great Decisions Group. Thank you very much for the topic tonight. My question for Alex and Kimberly are, we mostly in America anyway, did not know that the Ukraine was such a huge supply of wheat for the rest of the world until the Russian war began against the Ukraine. What do you see going forward as this war continues into one more year, another year, where this wheat supply that is coming, I'll just use Ukraine rather than Russia. I'm not aware of Russia's. I do know, yes, if you want to mention that, that's fine. So what do you see going down the road for famine and food insecurity as this war continues? How worried, how concerned, what do we do? What should we be aware of? Because the war's not stopping. So that's my question.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can start. I mean, I think the bottom line, Mary Ellen, is I'm very concerned. I'm very worried because, like you said, I don't think the war is going to end anytime soon. And even if it did, the issues in terms of just fertilizer, I know your specific question was on wheat, are not going to be solved quickly. These are issues that are having long-term impacts, not just the short-term impacts. And that's important to keep in mind. But I am an eternal optimist, which is hard to do having worked in this industry for a few decades, but I will say that one of the opportunities here, and I truly feel this way, is because we realize the dependency on so few countries. When it disrupts a supply chain like this, you're forced to rethink it in a new way. You are forced to figure out how to better take grain from one region of a continent that can produce more to another. You're forced to think of new partnerships, but that is something that is not going to happen quickly because the complexity of this, which is why I find it so fascinating. But you're talking about trade laws, you're talking about local regulations, you're talking about bringing private sector in, to maybe work with public sector, which they speak totally different languages. You're talking about some local markets that have not been built up at all in country, and it takes a long time to do that right. However, if creative and if focused, it actually creates an opportunity for other countries to step up. It creates an opportunity for new partnerships. And it also really shows to many countries the challenges if you're going to be that dependent upon one supply or one crop of what that's going to do to your country, and why you're going to have to open up new trade laws and new regulations and new partnerships with other areas of the world.
I think that's absolutely correct. I have nothing to add.
Okay. All right. So I have a question that Mary Ellen actually sort of inspired about private people. We're reading about these topics. We watch late night TV. We want to lend a hand in some way to these terrible situations that we see. Does it actually do any good to write a check or do it by PayPal to whomever, Red Cross or IRC or whoever you might pick?
It's the only thing that ever has done any good. I think if you look over 150 years at what has ended the most terrible famines, it is exactly this type of citizens' action. And it's not as though those small amounts in themselves have made the difference. But for those of us who were involved at the time of Band-Aid, Live Aid, 1984-85, it was the public outcry, the public giving to the cause of the famines in Ethiopia and Sudan and elsewhere that actually moved governments to think, okay, people care about this. We need to move. So the two answers, both of them positive. One is that there's a lot of expertise in the voluntary sector. They do the job much. Years ago they were enthusiastic amateurs. Now there's a real professionalism there that wasn't there when I started my career in this. And when they get active, then they can get. And citizens get active, then governments wake up too.
Excellent.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was wondering, Kimberly, particularly with your experience in government, your perspective on the voluntary sector getting engaged. It's folks at their kitchen tables.
I mean, kitchen tables where it's at. To be honest, I truly think it's just about the knowledge and the importance of what's happening around the world, not just in our community. It's not that our neighborhoods and communities and own country isn't important, it is. But I think just having knowledge first, having events like this and being a part of WorldBoston is a great example of just simply understanding what's happening in another country and how that impacts you. And also there's just so many misconceptions about aid in general. It's just understanding the basics about how much we give, how much of our budget, what's some good difference that it makes. By the way, it's less than 1% of the total US budget. Many people think it's much more. And a huge majority of that is long-term development aid. But I think in general, I think donations to international NGOs that work on this do make a difference. I think talking about it to friends and family makes a difference. And I think talking to your local representative makes a difference. It's all important.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for that shout out for getting informed. I think we are going probably for our last question to Pamela.
Oh, hi. Yes, thank you. It's been very interesting and humbling conversation. I am interested in Madagascar and curious what is causing its particular hunger problem, since you mentioned it wasn't conflict there.
Madagascar is a combination of history of poor governance on top of extreme poverty, and then it's one of those cases where in the south of the island there's been repeated drought associated with climate crisis, global warming. So there are places in the world. Fortunately, at the moment, not too many, but I'm afraid the number is only going to rise. That where it's going to be very difficult to farm, to produce food, and to sustain human life as the climate heats up, and we really have to do a better job right throughout in terms of mitigating, reducing carbon emissions, and providing emergency assistance to those most affected places in the world.
The only thing I would add to that is I think Madagascar, lots of other countries too, but the countries that are facing the worst climate shocks are those that are often contributing to the climate shocks the least. So for that one, it's almost how do we better stay accountable for the countries, including our own, that is responsible for so much of this, and how do we stay accountable to the commitments that have been made, because really the impacts are being felt in countries that are the hardest hit, but do not deserve. Well, nobody deserves it, but I mean they are not the contributor to what's created it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Wow, this is an incredibly difficult and important topic, and how much we appreciate Kimberly's and Alex's statements tonight. And thank you all for your questions as well. So with that, thanks to all and have a good night.